Ethan walked along the narrow forest path, the cold air biting at his skin, and the sound of his boots crunching on the frozen ground was the only thing he could hear until it came. The scream, sharp and broken, echoing between the trees, it was not the cry of an animal, it was the voice of someone in pain, someone in fear. He stopped, every muscle in his body tense, and his eyes scanned the shadows around him for movement. The forest was dark. The tall, alien trees, blocking the pale light of the moon and the wind, made the branches sway like long bony fingers, reaching for the ground. He heard it again, softer now, but still filled with desperation. It came from the east, near the edge of the hunting grounds, where no human usually dared to go. He moved quickly, his instincts telling him not to waste time. The path under his feet turned rough, the roots and rocks forcing him to slow, but the cries urged him forward, each one weaker than the last, until he feared there would be no more. He pushed through the thick brush, his jacket snagging on thorns, and his breath becoming heavy. Then he saw it, a faint glow between the trees, not from fire, but from something else. Something alive. He stepped closer, and the scene froze him in place. A young alien woman lay half in the dirt, half in the shadow, her leg caught in a jagged metallic trap, the cruel teeth of the device biting deep into her skin. Blood ran down into the soil, pooling dark and thick around the twisted metal. Her skin was pale with a strange silver tone, and her eyes wide and shining like liquid amber. Her hands clawed weakly at the trap, but she had no strength left. Her voice trembled as she whispered a single word. Help! Python rushed to her side, kneeling in the dirt. His hands went to the trap, trying to force it open, but the mechanism was old and rusted. The metal groaning in protest, he pulled harder. Ignoring the sharp edge that cut into his palm, she let out a hiss of pain, but did not tell him to stop. Her gaze flicked past him into the darkness, her breathing quick and shallow. She spoke again, but this time her voice was even weaker. It is coming back. The words chilled him more than the cold air. He glanced over his shoulder. The forest seemed too quiet. Now the wind had stilled, the branches no longer moved, and the silence pressed in on him as if the entire world was holding its breath. He turned back to the trap, and with one last effort, forced it open. The metal snapped apart, and her leg came free. She gasped, clutching his arm as he lifted her up, her weight light in his arms, but her body trembling with shock. He started toward the way he had come, his eyes scanning the trees for danger. She rested her head against his chest, her voice barely a whisper. Do not stop, keep going. He wanted to ask what she meant, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It was pure fear, and something else, something ancient and primal, a knowledge of a danger he could not yet see. Sound broke the silence, a long, low growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground under his feet. It came from deep within the forest, from the direction they had just left. The sound grew louder, changing into something like a distorted howl, the kind that made the skin crawl and the heart race. Ethan tightened his grip on her and picked up his pace. The trees seemed to close in around them, every shadow stretching longer and darker. They reached a small clearing where the moonlight touched the ground in silver streaks. He set her down for a moment to catch his breath, but she shook her head urgently. We cannot stay here. It will smell the blood. Her eyes darted to the tree line, her breathing ragged, her injured leg barely able to hold her weight. Ethan grabbed her hand, pulling her toward a narrow trail he knew led to an old hunting cabin, half forgotten by the settlers. Branches snapped somewhere behind them, the sound too deliberate to be the wind. He quickened his steps, almost dragging her along the path. Her bare feet stumbling over the uneven ground, he could feel her pulse racing through her grip, and his own heartbeat thundered in his ears. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the rustle of heavy movement through the undergrowth. They burst from the trees into a small clearing, and the cabin stood before them. Its wooden walls weathered, and its windows dark. Ethan pushed the door open with his shoulder, bringing her inside. He set her on an old bench near the fireplace quickly, pulling out the few supplies left behind: a roll of bandage, a flask of water, and a blanket. He wrapped her leg as best he could. The wound was deep, but he could not dwell on it now. The danger outside was too great. She stared at the door, her eyes, unblinking, the firelight casting trembling shadows across her face. Ethan asked, "What is out there?" but she only shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line as if speaking its name. Might bring it closer, then a sound came from outside, soft. At first like the crunch of a single step on frost, then another, and another, until it was clear something was circling the cabin, moving. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan's hand went to the hunting knife at his belt, his eyes fixed on the thin crack of light under the door. The sound of breathing came next, low, deep, and wrong, not like any animal. He knew the alien woman's voice trembled when she finally spoke. "It knows we are here." The handle of the cabin door began to turn. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat as the cabin door handle moved, the sound slow and deliberate, like the hand of whatever was outside wanted him to know it was there. He glanced at the alien woman, her golden eyes wide with fear, her body tense as if ready to flee, though she could not stand on her injured leg. The wooden floor creaked under Ethan's weight as he stepped closer to the door, his knife held tightly in his hand. The breathing outside deepened, and the handle twisted again before stopping. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It felt as though the whole forest had gone still, listening, waiting. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, each beat loud in his ears. He motioned for the alien woman to stay quiet, and she nodded, her hands gripping the bench so tightly her knuckles turned pale. A faint scrape came. Next, metal against wood, as if claws dragged slowly down the cabin wall. The sound moved from the door toward the window, and Ethan turned his head, following it, with sharp eyes. Through the narrow gap between the window boards, he caught the faintest glimpse of movement. A shape too tall for any normal creature, its form hunched and unnatural, the glow of two red eyes cutting through the darkness. He stepped back from the window, pulling the woman with him to a shadowed corner of the cabin. She whispered, "It can smell me. It will not leave until it has me." Ethan wanted to ask what it was, but he remembered her warning from before and kept his questions locked. Inside, the scratching outside stopped, replaced by the sound of something heavy stepping on the frozen ground, each step slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Ethan moved quietly to the old fireplace, searching for something to use besides his knife. He found a rusted fire iron and slipped it into his belt. His ears stayed alert to the sound outside. The alien woman whispered again, "You should not have helped me. It will hunt you too now." But Ethan shook his head, his voice low. "I was not going to leave you to die." A thump shook the wall near the window, dust falling from the beams. Above, the sound was powerful, like something testing the strength of the cabin walls. Ethan knew the door would not hold forever, he thought quickly, and remembered a back exit through the storage room. If they could slip out quietly, they might gain enough distance to hide until daylight. He helped her up, his arm around her waist, her weight leaning heavily against him, her breath short and quick with pain. They moved through the narrow hall toward the back door, every step making the floor groan in protest behind them. Another thump hit the wall, this time harder, followed by the sound of wood cracking. Ethan pushed open the back door, and the cold night air rushed in. He guided her into the trees, keeping low and moving as fast as her injured leg allowed. The sound of the cabin giving way echoed behind them. Then came the growl that shook the leaves and the branches above. The trail they followed twisted through the forest until Ethan spotted the faint outline of an old stone bridge over a frozen stream. He knew there was an abandoned hunter's cabin farther along. Past the bridge, if they could reach it before the creature caught up, they might have a chance to rest. But halfway across the bridge, the woman's foot slipped on the ice, and she fell with a sharp gasp. Ethan helped her up quickly, glancing behind them. The glow of red eyes was visible through the trees, drawing closer with each heartbeat. They left the bridge and stumbled into a narrow path, choked with roots and fallen branches. Ethan could hear the heavy steps of the creature, now no longer slow, but quickening into a hunt. They broke into a small clearing, where a half-collapsed Shed leaned against the trunk of a massive tree. Ethan pulled her inside the dark space barely large enough for them to crouch together. The sound of the creature came closer, then stopped just outside the clearing. Ethan's breath was slow and steady. Though his muscles were tense, ready to move at any second, the alien woman's hand clutched his arm, trembling. She leaned close, her voice almost too quiet to hear. It is not just hunting for food, it hunts for sport. She closed her eyes as though remembering something terrible. Then the silence shattered. The creature let out a howl so deep it rattled the air around them. The shed shook, dust falling from the old roof. Ethan tightened his grip on his knife, ready to face it if it found them. But instead of attacking, the creature began to move away, its steps fading into the forest. The woman looked at him, confused. "It is not leaving," she whispered. "It is circling to cut us off." Ethan nodded, understanding the danger. They had to move now. He helped her to her feet, and they left the shed, moving quickly through the trees, heading toward the hills where the old mining tunnels lay hidden in the rock. If they could reach the tunnels before the creature caught them, they might find a place to defend themselves. The path uphill was steep, and her injured leg slowed. The darkness swallowed them as they stepped deeper into the tunnel, the walls closing in on both sides, and the sound of their own breathing seeming too loud in the silence. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint smell of minerals and something older, something that felt like it had been trapped here for centuries. Ethan kept one arm around Lyra, supporting her as she limped forward, her bare foot scraping against the stone floor. With each step she clung to him, her head turning slightly as if listening to sounds he could not hear them. Narrow passage twisted and turned, forcing them to move slowly. Ethan's fingers brushed the walls as he guided them and felt the strange texture of the stone, smooth in some places and jagged in others. They reached a wider chamber where faint glows shimmered from clusters of crystals embedded in the rock. The light painted the space in shades of blue and green, giving the air an otherworldly feel. Lyra's eyes reflected the glow, making her look almost like she belonged to the cave itself. She stopped for a moment, her gaze fixed on the crystals. She whispered, "These are the veins of the earth. Here they keep away certain things, but not for long." Ethan wanted to ask what she meant, but his voice caught in his throat because from somewhere deep in the tunnel behind them came the slow scrape of claws against stone. The sound was steady, like a predator closing and without rushing, knowing its prey could not escape. Ethan guided her quickly toward the next passage, the crystals casting faint light on their path. They moved through another bend and came to a fork in the tunnel. One path, narrow and dark, the other slightly wider but lined with more of the glowing crystals. Lyra hesitated, her voice low. "We must take the crystal path. It will not follow us there." But she looked at him with concern. "It will be dangerous for you." Ethan did not hesitate. He nodded, and they took the crystal path, their steps quick but careful to avoid touching the sharp edges. The air seemed to hum faintly as they walked deeper, the crystals emitting a low vibration. Ethan felt it in his bones, like a distant pulse. Lyra's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the hum. "These crystals are deadly to its kind, but they can also burn human skin." Ethan kept moving his focus on the way ahead, though the feeling of being hunted never left him. They reached another chamber, larger than the first, its ceiling high enough for their footsteps to echo faintly. Pools of water reflected the glow of the crystals, creating shifting patterns on the walls. Lyra knelt at the edge of one pool, washing the blood from her injured leg. Ethan scanned the chamber, his hand tightening on his knife. Then he noticed something that made his stomach knot. Fresh claw marks etched into the stone near the far wall. He moved closer to inspect them, the grooves deep and uneven, as if made in rage. The sight confirmed what he feared. The creature had been here before, and perhaps it still knew these tunnels better than they did. As he turned back to Lyra, the sound came again, this time from above, a faint scrape followed by the sound of small stones falling from the ceiling. He looked up into the shadows, and for a moment thought he saw the gleam of red eyes before they vanished. Wire's voice was urgent. We must move now." She stood with effort, her face pale, but determined. Ethan took her hand, and they left the chamber, entering a narrow, upward-sloping tunnel. The ground uneven and damp, the air grew colder with each step, and Ethan's breath came out in visible clouds behind them. The sound of claws grew louder, echoing through the twisting stone like a drumbeat of pursuit. The tunnel ended in a jagged opening that led to a narrow ledge overlooking a deep chasm. The bottom, lost in darkness. A faint draft of cold air rose from below, carrying with it the scent of something foul. Lyra pointed to a ledge on the other side, just wide enough for a careful crossing. "There is another tunnel there," she said, "but we must go one at a time." Ethan looked at her injured leg and shook his head. "You go first, I will follow." She nodded and began her slow, careful crossing, her hands pressed to the rock wall for balance. Halfway across, she froze, her eyes wide. Ethan followed her gaze and saw the shadow of the creature emerging from the tunnel behind them, its form massive and hunched, its red eyes glowing in the dim light. It stepped forward, claws scraping the stone, its gaze locked on them. Ethan moved quickly onto the ledge, urging Lyra to keep going. The creature let out a deep growl, the sound vibrating through the stone under their feet. They reached the other side, just as the creature stepped onto the ledge, the narrow path forcing it to move slowly. Ethan pulled Lyra into the next tunnel, then turned to face it, his knife ready. The ledge trembled under the creature's weight, a piece of rock breaking away and falling into the chasm with a distant crash, but it kept coming, its eyes never leaving them. Ethan backed into the tunnel, forcing it to follow, knowing they needed to lead it somewhere they could fight on their own terms. The tunnel ahead twisted sharply and opened into another chamber, this one filled with taller crystal formations, their glow brighter and the hum stronger. Ethan realized this could be their chance. Lyra whispered, "It will not cross too far into this place. If we can trap it between the crystals, we can stop it here." Ethan nodded, his mind already forming a plan. He would have to lure it in close enough for the crystals to weaken it, but not so close that it could strike first. Sound of claws grew louder as the creature entered the chamber, its growl low and menacing, its eyes flicking between them and the crystals. Its steps slow, deliberate. It seemed to sense the danger, but hunger and rage pushed it forward. Ethan's grip tightened on his knife, his body tense, every muscle ready for the moment to strike. Lyra stepped back into the shadows, watching him, her eyes filled with both fear and trust. Ethan took one step forward into the glow of the crystals. The creature followed, its claws scraping the stone, its breath heavy in the cold air. The hum of the crystals grew louder, as if the earth itself was warning of what was to come them with each step. Ethan could feel the air growing colder, the wind sharper. As they climbed, the sound of the creature returned from the left side, this time closing in fast. Ethan's eyes searched desperately for cover. Then he saw it had cracked in the hillside, just wide enough for them to slip inside. He pulled her into the darkness, the narrow space smelling of earth and stone, the walls damp and cold inside. The crack, the sound of the creature's steps grew louder until it stopped right outside the entrance. They held their breath, neither daring to move. The shadow of its body blocked the faint moonlight spilling into the opening. The air was heavy with the smell of decay. Then, without warning, the shadow shifted, and the sound of claws scraping against stone filled the space. Ethan realized the creature knew they were inside, and the only way out was past it. The alien woman opened her eyes, her voice low and steady. "There is another way deeper inside, but we will have to go through the dark, without light, without sound, and without stopping." He nodded, and together they stepped deeper into the narrow tunnel, leaving the faint light of the entrance. Behind, Ethan stood still, his body tense, his eyes locked on the massive creature that crept slowly toward him, the faint glow of the crystals around them casting shifting shadows across its twisted form, its skin dark and rough like weathered stone, and its long claws gleaming in the dim light. The low growl in its Throat rumbled through the chamber as it stepped closer, the hum of the crystals growing. Stronger with each movement, the air heavy with the smell of decay, and something ancient. Lyra stayed in the shadows, her back against the wall, her breath shallow. She knew the danger of being too close to the crystals for too long, but she also knew they were the only thing keeping the creature from attacking at full speed. Her eyes never left Ethan, who held his knife low, his stance ready for the smallest. Opening, the creature paused, its red eyes flicking from Ethan to the glowing crystals. Then back again, a slow hiss escaping between its jagged teeth. Ethan took one small step backward, drawing the creature deeper into the chamber. The hum of the crystals seemed to vibrate through his chest, making his heart beat faster. He glanced toward Lyra for a split second, and she gave the faintest nod, telling him to continue the plan. They had no time for mistakes. One wrong move, and the ledge they crossed earlier would become their grave. The creature followed another step, its claws scraping against the stone floor, leaving deep marks as it moved its head low, its gaze fixed on him. The glow from the nearest cluster of crystals reflected in the black pits of its eyes, and Ethan saw it, flinched the slightest twitch in its stance. He took another step sideways, leading it toward the largest formation, the hum, there almost a deep pulse in the ground. The creature hesitated, then lunged forward with surprising speed, forcing Ethan to dodge to the side, its claws slashing the air where he had stood. He rolled across the floor, coming up near the crystal formation, just as the creature turned to face him again. Lyra shouted from the shadows, "Now!" Ethan, without thinking, grabbed a loose shard of crystal from the ground, its surface cold and sharp the moment it touched his skin. A burning sensation shot through his palm, but he ignored the pain. The creature lunged again, and this time he thrust the shard toward it, the tip grazing the rough hide. A hiss of smoke rising from the wound, the creature roared in fury, the sound shaking loose dust from the ceiling above it. Backed away for a moment, but Ethan pressed forward, forcing it closer to the cluster of crystals, each step making it flinch as the hum vibrated through its body. Lyra moved from her hiding spot, circling around the edge of the chamber, her eyes searching for a way to block the path. Back to the tunnel, she spotted a fallen crystal formation large enough to wedge across the entrance and began dragging it with all her strength, her injured leg trembling with the effort. The creature sensed her movement and turned its head, giving Ethan the chance to strike again. He drove the shard into its shoulder, the smell of burning flesh filling the chamber as it screamed, the sound deafening and filled with rage. Lyra managed to push the crystal block into place, sealing the tunnel. Just as the creature turned to escape, it slammed into the crystal barrier, but the contact burned it, forcing it back toward Ethan, who now stood between it and the only way out. The glow of the crystals around them seemed brighter, the hum louder. As if reacting to the struggle, the creature's movements became less steady, its steps sluggish, its claws leaving less forceful marks on the stone. Ethan saw the moment to end it. He feinted to the left, then dove to the right, driving the crystal shard deep into its chest. The roar that followed echoed through the tunnels like a storm. The creature staggered back, colliding with one of the largest crystal formations, its body convulsing as the glow spread through its veins. Lyra limped forward, watching as the creature let out one final breath before collapsing to the ground, its body twitching once, then falling still. The hum of the crystals began to fade slowly until the chamber was silent except for the sound of their breathing. Ethan pulled the shard free and dropped it, his hand throbbing from the burn. He looked at Lyra, who managed a faint smile, though her face was pale from exhaustion. They both knew the danger was not truly over. Lyra's voice was quiet. "There are more of them. This one was only a scout," her words made Ethan's stomach tighten. He looked toward the blocked tunnel, thinking about the forest above. If there were more creatures, then every step outside would be a new risk. Lyra touched his arm, her eyes steady. "We have to move before the others come. The hum may have drawn them." Ethan nodded and helped her toward another exit at the far end of the chamber, a narrow path. Winding upward, the air colder as they climbed the faint light of the moon. Eventually spilling onto their faces, as they emerged onto a rocky hillside, the forest spread out below, silent under the night sky. For now, there was no sign of movement, but both of them knew the quiet would not last. They made their way down the slope, careful not to slip on the loose stones, the wind carrying the scent of pine and the distant hint of smoke, perhaps from a human settlement. Ethan felt the weight of exhaustion in his limbs, but he kept moving, knowing that stopping here was not an option. Lyra leaned on him, her leg weak, but her steps determined, her gaze always flicking back toward the darkness of the forest, as if expecting to see glowing red eyes emerge from the trees. When they finally reached the edge of the woods, Ethan paused, scanning the shadows to silence around them, almost too perfect. Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. "It is watching us even now." He followed her gaze, but saw nothing, yet the feeling of being hunted lingered like a shadow they could not shake. Together, they stepped into the trees, leaving the rocky hillside behind, heading toward whatever safety they might find before the night claimed them again. The forest seemed endless as Ethan and Lyra pushed deeper into the shadows, the moonlight barely touching the ground through the thick canopy above. Each step was careful and slow, the sound of their feet muffled by the soft layer of leaves that covered the earth. Yet the silence around them was unnatural, too still, too watchful. Ethan could feel it in his bones, the sensation of eyes following them from somewhere just out of sight, the weight of it pressing on his shoulders with every movement. Lyra leaned heavily on him, her injured leg slowing them, but her determination unbroken. She glanced over her shoulder again and again, her golden eyes scanning the darkness as though she could see shapes hidden from human sight. Her voice was low and steady. "They will come for us soon. We must find shelter before the next moonrise." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight, his mind racing through the limited places he knew in this part of the alien forest, but most were too close to open ground or too easy for a predator to reach them. Air grew colder as they moved downhill toward the faint sound of running water, the smell of damp earth growing stronger with each step. Ethan hoped the stream might mask their scent, at least for a while. They reached the bank and followed it. Upstream, the water glowing faintly in the moonlight from strange minerals within the stones. Lyra paused, bending to wash the blood from her leg again, but Ethan kept his eyes on the opposite bank, where the shadows seemed to shift and ripple. Though no wind moved, the branches he caught a flicker of red light between the trees, and his grip tightened on his knife. Lyra straightened, her voice tense. "It is not the same one from before. This one is faster and smarter." Ethan scanned the forest, knowing they had only moments before it would strike. He led her along the stream until they reached a fallen tree bridging the water, the trunk thick enough to walk across without slipping. He helped her over his eyes, never leaving the darkness behind them. Halfway across the sound came a deep, heavy thud of claws hitting the earth, followed by the quick rustle of something large moving through the undergrowth. The sound grew louder. In seconds, Ethan pushed Lyra ahead, urging her to move faster. They reached the far bank and stumbled into a narrow ravine, its walls high and close, the path twisting sharply between jagged rocks. The confined space made it harder for anything large to move quickly behind them. The predator's growl echoed through the ravine walls, vibrating through the stone like a warning. They pressed forward until the ravine opened into a small clearing where the moonlight poured down unobstructed. In the center stood a structure of stone and wood so old it seemed part of the forest itself, its roof half collapsed, its walls covered in moss. Ethan moved them inside, finding it surprisingly intact within, the air dry and still, the faint smell of ash suggesting it had once been a shelter long abandoned. Lyra leaned against the wall, her breathing heavy, her eyes closed for a moment. As she gathered her strength, Ethan explored quickly, searching for anything they could use to defend themselves. He found old spears, their shafts splintered but still sharp at the tips. He brought to back to where Lyra rested, she took one in her hands. Testing its weight and balance, she met his eyes and gave a small nod. This will do for one strike, maybe. Two, they both knew it would not be enough against what hunted them, but it was better than nothing. The growl came again, this time closer and more deliberate, the sound of claws clicking on stone as the predator entered the ravine. Ethan stepped to the doorway, his spear ready, his body tense. The moonlight revealed the creature as it emerged from the shadows, its body leaner than the last but no less dangerous, its movements smooth and calculated. Its glowing eyes locked on him. It stopped just at the edge of the clearing, as though measuring the distance between them. Lyra shifted her position in the corner, her spear angled low. Her eyes fixed on the doorway, Ethan took a slow breath, then stepped back into the shelter. The creature responded with a sudden lunge, crossing the clearing in a blur of movement, its claws striking the doorway, sending splinters of wood flying. Ethan thrust his spear forward, the tip scraping across its hide and forcing it back a step, but the strength of the impact numbed his arm. It circled the shelter, its claws tapping against the walls, testing for weakness. Lyra moved closer to the doorway, ready to strike if it tried again. They heard the scrape of its claws on the back wall, and then silence. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized it was climbing the structure. The roof creaked under its weight, dust falling into the room above them. The shadow of its body blocked the moonlight through the gaps in the wood without warning. It broke through a section of the roof, its head and one claw forcing their way inside. Ethan and Lyra struck together, their spears jabbing at its exposed flesh. The creature roared, pulling back but not retreating. It struck again, this time ripping away a larger section of the roof, the cold night air rushing in along with the smell of its breath, hot and rancid. Ethan knew they could not hold the shelter for long. He grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her toward the back wall where the stones had shifted over time, leaving a narrow opening just wide enough to squeeze through. They slipped out into the darkness, the sound of the creature tearing apart the shelter behind them, its rage echoing through the clearing. They ran through the trees, Lyra limping but keeping pace, driven by fear and determination. The forest ahead began to slope upward again, the ground rough with roots and stones, the faint light of the moon guiding their way. Ethan could still hear the creature crashing through the trees behind them, its pace relentless. They reached the base of a cliff where a narrow path wound upward, and without hesitation began the climb. The higher they went, the sharper the wind became, carrying with it the distant scent of smoke again. Stronger now, perhaps, from a human camp. As they neared the top, Ethan risked a glance back. The creature was climbing to its claws, digging into the rock with unnatural ease. They pushed harder, reaching the ridge where a line of jagged stones formed a barrier. They slipped behind the rocks, pressing themselves flat as the creature reached the top, its glowing eyes scanning the ridge. It moved slowly, sniffing the air, but after a tense moment, it turned and retreated down the cliff, disappearing into the darkness below. Ethan and Lyra exchanged a silent look, knowing this would not be the last time they saw. The ridge was cold and sharp beneath their hands, the stone biting into their skin as they crouched behind it. The wind cut through the night, carrying with it the smell of pine and the faint trace of smoke from somewhere beyond the hills. Ethan kept his eyes on the darkness below, where the creature had vanished, but the forest seemed still again. No sound of claws, no rustle of branches, yet the silence was heavy, as if the land itself held its breath. Lyra leaned against the stone, her injured leg trembling with strain, but her gaze never leaving the shadows. Her voice low, "It will not stop. This is its ground, and we are prey until it decides otherwise." Ethan scanned the ridge, looking for any path forward. The jagged stones stretched in both directions, their sharp edges glowing faintly under the pale moonlight. He spotted a narrow trail that sloped down toward a deeper valley, where the forest thickened again, and beyond that, a faint orange flicker that could be firelight, maybe a camp, maybe hope. He helped Lyra to her feet, their movements slow to avoid making noise, and together They began the descent, the path twisting between boulders and loose gravel that threatened to slide under their weight. The valley floor was damp and covered in thick moss. Their steps almost soundless now, the air warmer as they moved deeper between the trees, the firelight ahead growing stronger each step, sending a faint glow through the undergrowth. Ethan slowed, raising a hand for Lyra to stop. He crouched low, peering between the trunks until he saw a small circle of light in a clearing, a campfire burning low, surrounded by crude shelters made from branches and hides. But no movement, no voices, only the crackle of the fire. They approached cautiously, Ethan's knife ready. The camp was empty, but not abandoned. Scraps of food lay scattered near the fire, and a pot of water still steamed faintly. Someone had been here very recently. Lyra moved to one of the shelters, running her hand over the rough fabric, her eyes narrowing. They left in a hurry, she said, her tone uneasy. Ethan looked around the clearing. The ground churned with deep claw marks that cut into the earth, leading from the edge of the trees straight into the camp and out the other side, as if something had passed through, fast and wild. The sound came, then faint, but clear from the forest behind them, the slow, heavy tread of claws on damp ground. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. He grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her toward the far side of the clearing, away from the trail of claw marks. They slipped between the trees, the campfire light fading behind them as the darkness closed in. The sound of pursuit grew louder, not rushing this time, but steady, deliberate, like a hunter herding its prey toward a chosen place. Ground rose beneath their feet, and soon they were climbing again, the trees thinning until they reached a ridge of stone that jutted out over a drop below them. A narrow gorge ran through the forest, its walls steep and lined with jagged rock, the only crossing a fallen tree that spanned the gap. Ethan led Lyra onto it, the trunk wide enough for careful steps, but slick with moss. The sound of claws echoed behind them, growing closer, faster. He urged her to move quickly, the gorge yawning black beneath them. Halfway across, the growl came deep and resonant, vibrating through the wood under their feet. Ethan risked a glance back. The creature emerged from the shadows, its body low to the ground, its glowing eyes fixed on them. It stepped onto the trunk with slow precision, each claw digging into the bark for grip. Ethan pushed Lyra forward. She reached the far side and turned to see him still halfway across, the predator closing in with terrifying calm. Ethan knew he could not simply outrun it. Here he had to slow it down. He planted his feet and thrust his knife into the trunk, carving at the moss-covered surface. To make it slick, the creature's next step slid slightly, its balance shifting just enough for Ethan to press the attack. He swung the knife in a wide arc, the blade grazing its foreleg, drawing a hiss of pain. It lunged forward faster now, forcing Ethan to retreat step by step until he reached the far side. Lyra grabbed his arm and they ran into the forest, leaving the gorge behind them. The trees ahead grew close again, their branches twisting together to block much of the moonlight. The darkness was thick here, and every shadow seemed to move. Ethan slowed, listening for the sound of pursuit, but the forest was silent once more, too silent. Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. "It is not following." She looked around, her expression tense. "This is worse. It means it is circling." Ethan knew she was right. The hunter's instinct was to drive them where it wanted them to go. They pressed on until they reached a wide open space where the ground was bare and cracked, the smell of sulfur rising from vents in the earth, faint wisps of steam drifting into the air. Lyra stopped, her eyes widening. "This is a hunting ground," she said, her voice tight. "This is where it finishes the chase." Ethan scanned the space, the open ground, giving no cover, the vents releasing bursts of heat and steam in unpredictable patterns. He realized they would have to use the terrain to their advantage or die here. He pulled Lyra toward a cluster of vents where the bursts of steam were strongest, the hot air stinging his skin as it escaped in sudden gusts. He positioned her behind a large vent and crouched low, his knife ready. The silence held for only a moment before the growl rolled across the ground. The creature stepped into the clearing, its movements slow. Its eyes locked on them, It paced along the edge, circling, testing the steam vents with careful steps before advancing further. The hunt had reached its endgame. The steam hissed in short bursts, rising in twisting columns around Ethan and Lyra. The ground beneath them, warm and trembling. As if something deep below stirred, the creature stood at the far edge of the cracked earth, its eyes glowing with a steady hunger, its body low and tense, each step it took forward, deliberate and careful, avoiding the hotter vents. Its head tilted slightly, as if studying the paths between the openings, searching for the safest way to reach them. Ethan tightened his grip on the knife, feeling the sweat on his palm, though the air around them was cool. Lyra crouched behind a large vent, her golden eyes fixed on the predator. Her breath slow and measured, her voice barely a whisper. "We must make it step where the heat is strongest." Ethan nodded, his mind racing for a way to draw it in. He stepped from behind the vent, moving slowly into the open, his boots crunching against the brittle surface. The creature's gaze locked on him, its muscles shifting under its skin. Like coiled ropes ready to strike, it advanced one step, then another, weaving between the vents with the precision of something that had hunted in such places before. Ethan backed away, keeping his movements controlled, leading it toward a section where the vents erupted in stronger bursts of steam, each one hot enough to scald. Lyra watched every move, her hands gripping the spear they had taken from the abandoned camp. Her injured leg pressed against the ground to keep from giving out. She could see the creature's focus fixed on Ethan and knew her moment would come soon. Ethan reached the edge of the dangerous section and stopped, letting the predator close the distance. Its claws scraped the cracked surface, sending faint vibrations through the ground. It lunged forward, forcing Ethan to dive to the side as a vent erupted between them, the scalding steam hitting its flank. The creature let out a screech, a sound raw and furious that echoed across the clearing. It recoiled for only a moment before surging forward again, faster, now driven by rage rather than caution. Ethan rolled to his feet and slashed with the knife, grazing its forearm. The smell of burnt flesh mixing with the sulfur in the air. It swiped back, its claws passing just inches from his chest, forcing him to retreat further toward another cluster of vents. Lyra shifted her position, circling around the outer edge of the field, her movements hidden by the rising steam. The predator caught her scent and turned its head just enough for Ethan to see an opening. He lunged forward, aiming the knife at its side, but it twisted with startling speed, knocking him to the ground, his breath leaving him in a sharp gasp. It moved in for the kill, but a sudden burst of steam from a vent between them slowed its advance. Ethan scrambled back to his feet, his chest aching and his grip on the knife unshaken. Lyra saw him stand and took her chance. She stepped from the steam, her spear aimed low, and drove it into the creature's hind leg, the tip sinking deep into muscle. It roared, spinning toward her, its claws raised. Ethan seized the distraction and charged, slamming the knife into its shoulder, the force driving them both toward the vents. Another eruption of steam engulfed them, the heat searing skin and filling the air with a blinding white cloud. The predator thrashed wildly, its movements uncoordinated as it tried to escape the scalding burst. Ethan pulled the knife free and staggered back, his vision blurred from the heat. Lyra limped to his side, her spear still clutched in her hands, though the shaft was now splintered. The creature stumbled, its breathing ragged, its steps uneven, the steam having burned through parts of its thick hide, exposing raw flesh. It turned to flee, but Ethan stepped forward, blocking its path, his voice low. "You will not hunt us again," the predator growled, its strength fading, yet its eyes still burning with hate-a-thon. Waited for the next burst of steam to erupt, then drove the knife into its chest. Using every ounce of strength left in his body, the creature let out one final screech before collapsing onto the cracked earth, the sound echoing through the clearing and fading into silence. Its body twitched once, then lay still. The steam hissed around them, the only movement now the slow rise and fall of the hot mist. Lyra stood over the fallen predator, Her expression unreadable, her breathing slow. She looked at Ethan and gave a small nod. They left the body where it fell, moving carefully between the vents until they reached the safety of the forest, the cooler air a relief after the heat of the hunting ground. The night seemed quieter now. The oppressive weight of the hunt lifted, though neither spoke. For a long while the moonlight guided their steps through the undergrowth, until the smell of smoke grew stronger and the faint glow of firelight appeared between the trees. They approached cautiously, ready for another danger, but found a small human settlement, its inhabitants startled by the sudden appearance of two strangers emerging from the dark. A man stepped forward, his face weathered and his eyes sharp. He listened as Ethan told him briefly of the hunt and the creature they had killed. The man's gaze moved to Lyra and lingered on her injured leg before he nodded and gestured for them to follow inside the settlement. They were given water and a place to sit near the fire, the warmth easing the cold that had settled deep into their bones. Lyra leaned against the wall, her eyes half closed but her voice still steady. "You saved me more than once this night, Ethan." Shook his head. "You saved me too. We would not have survived alone." Her gaze softened and she said then, "Perhaps we should not be alone anymore." Ethan looked into the fire, the crackle of the flames a comfort against the memory of the predator's growl. He knew the hunt was over for now, but the forest was wide and dark, and there were more of its kind out there somewhere waiting. The night might come again with red eyes in the shadows, but for this moment they had survived together.